always a great way to start end our program, keep the rest of the day going, is with a chat with Pat, and particularly on Thursday because it's Joni.
I know. You just can't have a better guest, I don't think, than Joan Watson. I know I'm biased. Joan Watson is an author and a speaker, and we've talked about one of her books before. This one is called Making a Pilgrimage, and we're doing a pilgrimage with a book on pilgrimages. We're making our way through it. Welcome, Joni. How you doing today?
It's great to be with you as always.
I
Happy
know
Thursday.
I love hearing your voice. Today, though, I'll tell you, this segment, Joni, kind of went, woo, when I looked at it. And I kind of teased it a little bit earlier in the show. The idea that you did a section on the pilgrimage that changed history, and it has to do with Martin Luther. So talk to us about this, would you?
Yeah, so last week we talked about a pilgrim who came to Rome in search of faith, really. Peter of Prague came on pilgrimage to Rome because he was beginning to doubt in the real presence, and that pilgrimage ended up having a profound impact on his life and on his belief in the real presence. And I follow that story up in the book with this very famous pilgrimage of Martin Luther to Rome. Martin Luther later would point to his time in Rome as really being pivotal in his own falling away from the faith, of his own disillusionment with the church. And, you know, there's scholars who kind of dispute this. Some scholars will say later he kind of makes a big deal about it, but at the time it probably wasn't that big a deal. Like, it later becomes a better story. He would tell later the story of him going up the Holy Stairs, which are the stairs that Queen Helen, who we've talked about, brought back from the Holy Land to Rome. You know, they're the stairs that Christ walked up in Jerusalem. And so Martin Luther will tell this story later that he was like halfway up and he realized that, you know, we are saved through faith alone and works are useless. And he stands up and walks down the stairs because that's the moment where he has this theological, you know, and a lot of his biographers say, you know, he says this later in life, oftentimes when he has an audience and he's been drinking beer, which I thought was quite hilariously lovely, right? He wants to entertain, right? So his stories get more dramatic. So, but even despite that, we know that his time in Rome did really impact him because he saw the sins in the church. He saw, you know, priests rushing through the Mass who didn't even know what they were saying. You know, they would say these Masses in Latin in like 9 minutes so that they could do, you know, say another Mass and take another stipend. And so out of this experience comes a lot of his disillusionment with the church and eventually will lead to him wanting to break from the church.
I love, Joni, that you kind of say that this is something he kind of tells more later, not at the beginning of his of the whole Reformation process, that this comes at the end. And I think you're right. I would tend to think maybe he did have a little grandiose explanation of what, but I don't disagree. I'm sure there were those kinds of things happening in Rome because at that time, other things were happening. That's for sure. But you kind of bring us back after describing this kind of pilgrimage that changed history. You bring us back to this concept then of a penitential pilgrimage, which I think is really interesting because it's one of my favorite saints. So can you talk to us about this?
Yeah, so, you know, we can learn a lot from Luther's pilgrimage in that, you know, we are always going to face sin in the church. Pilgrimages are not a way for us to flee the world. In fact, they're a way for us to enter kind of more deeply into the world in prayer and in penance. And so I juxtapose this Martin Luther story with the story of St. Catherine of Siena, who, if anybody faced sin in the church, it was Catherine of Siena. I actually just published a couple months ago my third book on Catherine and tackled this a lot in that book. But Catherine, you know, is living in a time where, first of all, the Pope isn't living in Rome, trying to get the Pope to come back to Rome. She has to deal with a lot of political strife between the church and Florence, for example. And then eventually, when she's dying, she's dealing with two popes. We have this Great Western Schism. And Catherine perhaps faces in the 14th century the greatest evils in the church, but continues to love the church. And so I think we need to juxtapose Martin Luther with Catherine. Yes, there's sin in the church, absolutely, and this isn't to downplay it. It's to remind us that what are we called to do in the face of that sin? We're really called to do two things. Number one, we're called to reform ourselves, because reform in the church begins with me and changing my life. And secondly, we're called to pray for the church. So when Catherine comes to Rome at the end of her life, the Pope asks her to come to Rome to support him, because now he has this rival Pope. She comes to Rome, and in the last months of her life, she actually walks on pilgrimage from her home near Santa Maria Sopra Minerva to St. Peter's every single day, showing us that pilgrimage doesn't need to be international. We can walk down the street on pilgrimage. And she makes this pilgrimage every day in reparation for the sins of the church and, for the Pope and for strength and for his holiness. And so it's a good reminder to us both of what we do in the face of sin, but also what we're called to do as Christians to pray and to make penance for our sins and for the sins of those in the church.
So how did Catherine, did she come to Rome for this crisis of the Avignon papacy, or was she going for another reason?
She came, so after the Avignon papacy, she was living in Florence, Siena, Pisa at that time. She is actually afterwards when we get a new pope. The pope's living in Rome, but the French cardinals get upset and eventually elect their rival pope. And that's when she moves to Rome. So she's only in Rome the last few years of her life, living near a Dominican church and then praying and supporting the Pope, trying to get other holy men and women to move to Rome to pray for the Pope, to be on his side. And so she's only spending the last few years of her life in Rome because of this schism in the church. Yes.
Was she successful at getting other holy men and women to come to Rome and help in that, that kind of unification of the church?
Yeah, she has some people that join her. She has followers, and they join her. They live in community. They take care of her eventually, because there'll be this dramatic moment in her life. I tell the story in my book on Catherine, where she really suffers great physical distress because of the church, collapses, almost dies, carried back home, and they care for her in her last few months of her life. And so she does have her own followers and, the priests that she's been, basically being spiritual director for. But there's several letters she writes to very holy monks and very holy religious that the Pope has asked to come and be his kind of pastoral council, his parish council. He's asked these monks to come and pray for him and be his advisors. And we can tell from her letters that the monks are like, no, I'm staying here because I can be holy here, and I don't want to go to Rome where I might not be holy. And she has very little patience for that. Her letters to them are quite reprimanding that, if you can't be holy in the city of Rome, you can't be holy in the woods either. Like, we need to be holy in the world. So they're fascinating letters, but it sounds like he was fairly unsuccessful. Eventually the schism would end, of course, but Catherine would live to see that. She would die before him.
Yeah, I love that you use these two pilgrimages. Martin Luther, who, just kind of gives up on the church and says, well, it is supposed to be perfection, and since it's sinful, then let's do something else. And Catherine of Siena, who understands what the church is called to be and wants to restore it, and does it through a penitential offering, two very different pilgrimages, and that lead to very different places, one division, one unity. Joni, thank you so much for being with us. Can't wait to continue to dig into this book and then take a look at Catherine of Siena.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, all.
All right, have a good weekend, Joni.